Yeah, so I'm going to, as Frank says, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the work we're doing. A lot of it will be, you may have heard out in the paddock, but we'll be going over that again. Before I get going, I'd sort of like to acknowledge the expertise and knowledge in the room. I don't hold myself up as a super expert on this. I'm a scientist trying to learn what's going on. So if people have comments, experiences, want to pull me up and say, I don't think that's right, feel free to do so. So I'm working at Federation Uni, but I'm fairly new to the game. I've found that to say I work at a university gets a lot of people go, oh, well, you know, what would they know? But I've only been there for about 15 months or so. So I'll give a little bit of background, then talk about what we're trying to achieve with the subsoil amelioration, talk about why we're focusing on using compost, and the key question of, is it worth it? And that's something we try to work out through the trial. And then a little bit of the first year's worth of results. So in terms of the project team, Sustainability Victoria and Elmore Compost and Organics are co-funding the work. And I think I should have acknowledged up front the work that Frank, Liz and the family have done to get this field day together. Frank is one of the busiest people you'd meet. I don't think I've had a single conversation with him in 2 years where he hasn't been in a tractor or in a compost yard or doing something. And if you're out in a paddock with him, he's got his headpiece in and his phone's going, you know, once a minute he's doing stuff. So I really appreciate how much work Frank's done over the last few days to get this to come together. And then I'm working through Federation Uni. Other work that I'm doing in the soil health area, I'm working with the Gippsland Ag Group, again looking at, they've got seriously constrained soils, a healthy soils project around central Victoria, and with colleagues doing some work around biosolids and biochar reuse. I won't spend a lot of time. So Federation Uni, I'm with the Future Region Research Centre. They didn't think through that acronym. It's definitely, you do it as initials, not as a you don't say it because you get in trouble in polite company. And from Federation Uni, so it gets even worse in terms of if you initialise that one, but never mind. And the areas of research we work in are really, a lot of it's to do with sustainable land management. And I'm based down in the Ballarat campus, but also working out of Gippsland and getting some work going in the Wimmera. I guess the advantage of working at the uni is we have access to laboratories, and some of the colleagues have done work in this area as well. So I've been able to expand the project. Frank and I worked this project up together before I joined the uni, and I'm sort of able to do more as part of it now. But anyway, this is a challenge. I won't spend time on that. The real point there is I'm new to academia. I've spent most of my working life working in organic resource recovery and waste management and compost. I was co-owner of a business that became increasingly a waste data firm, and I realised I wanted to spend more time in a paddock, so started to do that, and then the role at university came up. And my main area of focus is soil constraints. I don't know how easy that is to read in this light, but really on the left there is what's more common for most of the cropping area and pasture area in Victoria, that we have constrained soils, they're shallow roots. When it rains, the water runs off, it doesn't infiltrate, which sort of exacerbates the problem. And a lot of my work's looking at, well, why is the soil constrained? Why aren't the roots getting in there? And trying to get a virtuous cycle going where the roots are deep, they're getting organic material down the profile, it's improving the soil profile so water gets down, and you get this virtuous cycle, which is the next slide, which again I won't spend a huge amount of time on, and that because it's hard to read. Have people got the handout? I've got a handout that's gone around on organic amendments and on soil amelioration. If you don't have a copy of that, get it. And I'll send it around electronically because they've got hyperlinks to them. But the idea is basically, this is the key. If you've got a healthier plant, you've got more yield, which is what the main focus in, but you've also got more organic matter and energy going back into the soil, feeding the cycle, getting nutrient cycling, and around it goes that you build your soil health, and that's what we're trying to achieve. And there is a lot of interest in this. A lot of people would have heard of regen agriculture and a lot of things being promoted there. The challenge we've got is a lot of our soils are very constrained and our climate is very constraining, particularly up here and north of here, that most summers it's hard to keep things alive. Every few years we get a drought, every 10 years we get a catastrophic drought. So it is a bit of a one step forward, one step back, hopefully 2 step forwards, 1 step back. Some years it's going to be 1 step forward, 2 steps back, but trying to work out how we manage that is the work I'm doing. And these sorts of profiles are really typical of the soils. This one here is typical of a soil I'm working on in Gippsland, where they've got a nice bit of loam on top, but then this terrible soil clay that I won't call it soil, it's clay, it's got no life in it, that roots just can't get into. Being Gippsland, it gets waterlogged in summer, and then during summer it dries out down near Bairnsdale. In terms of the potential yield gains in addressing these sorts of constraints, so CSIRO did work probably a decade or so ago where they, over 15 years, they looked at what the yield potential should be given the seasonal conditions and what was actually the average sort of yield. And across most of the cropping area in southeast Australia, people were getting about 30 to 50% of the yield potential, and most of that was to do with soil constraints. There are other factors, obviously disease and things like that, but the rain that fell that year, the temperatures they had that year, the yield they could have got, they were getting a third to a half of it. So there's great potential there. And I think it's, Andrew might correct me, I think people say 75 to 80% of the cropping land in Australia have these sorts of soil constraints. So the potential gain is huge. And work that's been done on soil amelioration, getting some yield gains of, sometimes it's lower, but sort of in that 30% to 100% yield increases above what you're getting just through fertility benefits. Sorry, having trouble driving this. So in terms of amelioration, you saw the unit out there. I've got in a moment I've got a video. But really what the unit's doing is putting this tube of compost down in the soil. You got to see that today. And the idea is to get it below that level of soil constraint. The profile we looked at, obviously we were breaking up a pretty solid clay pan at the surface, but we weren't really into the really constrained soil in that part of the paddock. Further up the rise we definitely are. And what we're trying to do is in year 1, get the roots down into the ameliorant growing strongly. The shatter zone around is a bit more freed up, and hopefully the roots start getting into that. In subsequent years they start colonising and conditioning the area around it. The compost, because it lasts longer and because it's full of organic compounds that help condition clay and help clay form better structure, and aggregates and have better nutrient exchange and water holding and water availability characteristics, the roots colonise that and start conditioning the soil around it. And the theory is by using a persistent matured compost ameliorant, it's going to last for years and you'll be able to see that benefit. A lot of the other work with just deep ripping or using a volatile, a more labile form of carbon isn't going to give that long-term benefit. So that's what we're trying to establish, whether that is the case. I've got a quick video here, I think, of the unit in operation for those who haven't seen it. I'll stop talking while that happens, but you can see, here I'm talking after saying I'll stop talking. But you'll see in a moment how easily it's flowing down the rip lines here, and there's been a lot of work done in particularly Western Australia using a range of ameliorants, in their case lots of lime and gypsum, and they've got real issues with flowability to the point that GRDC, the Grains Research Development Corporation, is doing work focused mainly on the flowability of materials. This compost here, well made, well screened, fine compost, flowed very well. So this is the product when it first went in. I think this is the 25 tonne per hectare treatment here, and this is the 10 tonne. In this light it's hard to see, but that's what we saw today when it went in the ground, quite similar to what you saw again today. So it has persisted for over a year now. That went in, was it March last year? Keep moving. This is, I mentioned out in the paddock, I mentioned the crop at the front when we came in off the main road that's been in the ground for 4 years. This was in February. We put down a core. This is the upper soil, so you can see when that soil's really dry what it's like. Again, it's dirt rather than soil. Hasn't got a lot of organic matter in it. And below you can see here that there's moisture here that the plant roots aren't getting to. It's hard to see in this light, but this potting mix of the compost that's there has got plant roots through it. So, it was particularly at that point things hadn't got really wet. It really showed the potential benefit of this approach. Most of this I've probably set out in the paddock, but the reason to use the matured compost is it's going to last in the soil. The composting process concentrates the more humic sort of elements, as well as the municipal stuff has got a lot of woody particles, larger woody particles that have been through the process, and they're pretty resistant to breaking down. They will break down over time, and particularly one of the paradoxes is if you've got a healthy soil and the soil biology is active, it will break down organic matter, but it's also full of compounds that will bind with clay and form long-lasting association with clay, which improves your water holding capacity, aggregate formation, nutrient exchange. It's a way of getting clays down the soil profile that are not getting that exposure to those humic compounds. You're saturating them, and they should stay there for decades, those associations. So it's really about getting matured product down there, stable product down there, and having this tube of potting mix and soil conditioning material through the soil. The other thing to note with the composting process, because you burn off all that labile stuff and it is a concentrate, I've done some figures looking at the sort of more stable component of a matured compost compared to straw, and particularly if you grow a green manure type product. Most of that stuff will be gone within a year or two, the straw and the green manures, whereas the compost will persist. And the figures I've got there, that 1 tonne of compost is going to be the same as retaining 2 to 10 tonnes of crop residue. Obviously the 2 is more your straw, the 10 is your green manure. And for a wheat crop, it would be retaining a stubble from a 1 to 7 tonne crop of wheat. So if you're adding it at say 10 tonnes per hectare, you're equivalent of adding 20 to 100 tonnes of crop residue, and we don't see too many 10 to 70 tonne wheat crops. So it's a way of speeding a process that would otherwise take many years to happen. And given the state of a lot of the soils, to get that virtuous cycle going, you need to give it a boost. And I'd love to see that we get to the day where agronomists go and look at your soil test, and as well as telling you what nutrients you need, they say, look, your organic content's down to 1%, you need compost, because I think that's what we need to do to keep the system.
We're already doing that.
You're doing it? Great, good, excellent. And in terms of is it worth it, I know this is some figures I've done, and I guess it's one of the things we hope to get out of the trial, but looking at what sort of yield response you're going to need. So comparing a RIP only sort of treatment with a RIP plus the amendment, the ameliorants, which I've priced at, this is at around 10 tonnes per hectare going on. So at $40 to $50 a tonne for the ameliorant, it gives you your $400 to $500 per hectare. Sorry, I should have put those units in. These are dollars per hectare. The ripping costs are a bit higher because specialised equipment, you go a bit slower. and the sort of return, a return on investment. We're not doing this to break even, so I've allowed about a 15% return on investment, and the yield you would need to if your grain average grain price is $350 a tonne, what sort of grain yield increase you would need. The real issue where obviously if the amendment lasted as long as a RIP, you wouldn't do it. It's expensive, but if you're getting 5+ years, I've done this assuming it works effectively for 5 years, the sort of yield response you'd need is not that dissimilar to ripping, but it means that rather than doing it every 2 years or 3 years, however often you would have to rip, you're hopefully doing it every 5 to 10 years. And that, something we hope to establish through this trial, collecting data off it over the next 5 to 10 years. In terms of the treatments, I think we've probably covered most of that in terms of control business as usual, RIP only and various treatments. I'll get into the results from the first year, which is a very wet year. So that's the site. So we did assessments. Probably the main things to see to that, as I said, out in the paddock, it's had this fairly heavy history of cropping. It's got, even though it was an organic paddock and it's had compost amendments added to it, it didn't have very high soil carbon, and it has got quite a few nutrient issues. It doesn't have acidity, which a lot of the soils I'm working on have got acidity issues. We got it in May 22, sort of ducking between showers a little bit. It just got wetter from there on. I went out and did in-field testing of plant heights and took plant samples of plant weight, tiller number data, which I'll put up in a moment. We didn't see a lot of difference. Water was not a limiting factor, I think it'd be fair to say, through it. And the harvest data, even though some of the treatments, I think the biochar treatment, poultry manure and the humisoil looked a little bit better when I took the field data. When it came to harvest, we didn't see a lot of difference, but a lot of that stuff, it was so tall that it slumped, so we ended up leaving a lot of straw in the paddock in those taller areas. So in terms of observations, and I'm counting these observations because the level of data off it is not enough to call it more than observation. So penetrometer testing, so that's really just a spike with a metre on it, where you measure the resistance of the soil. Probably unsurprisingly, certainly when it went in, you could really see the difference between the ripped and non-ripped areas. You would hope so. But right up to a few weeks ago when that hard pan has got really strong, and even now, once you get through that, it takes a lot of effort to get through it, you really notice when you're in a rip line that it drops down to another sort of 15, 20 centimetres in a lot of places. So, it suggests it's doing the job. I got into that paddock that's had it in for 4 years, and it was the same story there. So it's having that benefit. It's having the long-term benefit of keeping the rip line open. And as I say, and I think it's probably a factor of the very wet year we had, and the fact that soil, because it was certified organic, had more cultivation than other parts of Frank's farming operation. It really just slumped down, and I'm not finding the rip lines now at all. So that might be an unusual case given how wet things were, but certainly not seeing a lot of benefit on that soil. We are seeing the ameliorant persist in the soil, which is, I guess one of the main things we want to see, and we are seeing good root growth in that. And as I said out in the paddock, that whether it was just the compost was in a little clay pot and was holding water, or whether it was drawing water from the clay that had pretty good soil moisture but probably not very plant available moisture, I don't know, but I could pull ameliorant out and squeeze it and get water out of it in February. So the results, and I won't dwell on these too much, so these have got error bars on them. So I sampled, in each plot I sampled 5 different areas, so I had data about variability across each plot. the error bar tells you how variable things were. So I wouldn't hang my hat on these. I'm not going to publish a paper on this, but what we found is in terms of average plant height, most of the treatments performed, these ones performed better than the control with no treatment. These ones were no statistical difference, but they were higher overall. Interesting, the rip only was there, and that was before things really got too compacted, but it was a very wet season. And given that water was not a constraint, it's probably largely a nutrient factor. There might be some aeration of the soil benefits, but I think it was probably a nutrient response. I took samples from each of the sites, each of the sample points, and you see here the error bars are bigger, there was more variability. Disappointingly for a compost fan like myself, the compost treatments didn't perform as well there, but statistically there was no difference, and really possibly the compost and biochar did better than control, but it's right on the line. I don't know why that would be. I'm a little bit of a biochar skeptic, I've got to say, so I need to delve more into what might be going on there. And tiller number. So again, this is likely to be a nutrient response in terms of tillering is highly responsive to nitrogen, which I think is borne out there, but some of those treatments then, they carried on and did have more biomass at the time that I sampled in the field. But as I say, when we harvested, we really didn't see difference in yield or quality of the feed. But it was an unusual year. When I measured in the field, I saw some differences. Statistically, they weren't strong. When we harvested, which is the ultimate measure really, we didn't see a lot of difference in that very wet year. So we'll go on collecting data in more normal years ahead. Other opportunities really, I think if you're going to bother doing this, to have tailored products and start getting, in that paddock you wouldn't be adding lime, but you may add gypsum and fertiliser just to really get the benefit there, get the roots down there and start conditioning the soil. It is one practice. Other practices need to be considered. Jess and Joe are applying, so that first site we went to, Jess and Joe are here now, they're planting multi-species pastures, trying to get sort of that virtuous cycle going and conditioning the soil. And the other thing too, given the cost, you may not want to do your whole paddocks with this. I think some of the precision ag measures to look at where you're going to get the benefit and do those areas, and to maybe not do entire paddocks. And it could be that you rip the whole paddock, but you only put the ameliorant down in certain parts of the paddock. Yeah. So really, the conclusion is it does seem to have benefits. We'll watch this space.